So, Dr. Akinwale, please. 1 second.
Okay.
1 second. Please go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar organized by the Legal Studies Association. The theme of the webinar is Police Brutality, Violence, and the Crisis of Development in Nigeria. We all know that since the beginning of this month, there has been a lot of agitation for an end to police brutality in Nigeria. But the response of the states has not been too satisfactory. And as a result of that, there were deployment of security operatives, which led to shooting and unfortunate loss of life. So the situation has attracted attention of different institutions, both national and international, different organizations, and the violence that followed the shooting at Lekki has led to monumental destructions of lives and properties, including traditional institutions, high court, the Nigerian Port Authority. The list is endless, really. And it appears that the existence of the country was under threat. And matters arising from the current situation require serious engagement from different agencies. So LSA is a professional organization, and we have academic and non-academic intellectuals who are interested in, through research, contributing ideas and finding out possible solution for the current problem at hand. So I have with me in the house an array of academic and non-academic intellectuals. But before I introduce them, I wish to seek your indulgence for all of us to observe a minute silence for the deceased victims of police brutality and end SARS movement in Nigeria. May their gentle soul rest in perfect peace, and may their labor never go in vain. So my name is Akeem Ayofe Akinwale. I'm a faculty at University of Lagos, and I'm also the vice president of Legal Studies Association. The association provides a platform for knowledge production through collaboration between, like I said before, academic and non-academic intellectuals with a focus on the subject matter of sustainable development in Lagos and its environs. Members of the association are based in Africa, Europe, and North America. I've been asked to chair a panel in today's webinar, and I have with me, like I said before, an array of distinguished intellectuals who will stimulate discussions on the harrowing experience of police brutality, violence, and the crisis of development in Nigeria. The main objective of this webinar is to cross-fertilize ideas and map out a prescription for addressing the issues associated with police brutality, violence, and the crisis of development in Nigeria. The first person on the list of the panelists is Professor Moses Ochonu. Professor Moses Ochonu is a Cornelius Vanderbilt Chair in History and a Professor of African History at Vanderbilt University. He is the author of 3 books, such as Africa in Fragments, Essays on Nigeria, Africa and Global Africanity, published in New York by Diasporic Africa Press in 2014. His second book is titled Colonialism by Proxy, Hausa Imperial Agents and Middle Belt Consciousness in Nigeria. This was published in 2014 also by Indiana University Press. And his third prestigious book is Colonial Meltdown, Northern Nigeria in the Great Depression, published by Ohio University Press in 2009. Professor Ochonu is the editor of Entrepreneurship in Africa, a historical approach, published by Indiana University Press in 2018. Finally, Professor Ochonu's articles have been published as book chapters and in several scholarly journals. So I have the pleasure to introduce to you Professor Ochonu, and I welcome him to this webinar. The second on our list is Professor Mojubaolu Olufunke Okome. Professor Okome is a professor of political science at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. She is an international political economist with specialization in Africa in the global economy. She was educated at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, Long Island University, New York, and Columbia University, also in New York. She was director of Women's Studies Program and deputy chair for graduate studies in the Department of Political Science at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. Professor Okome was born in Nigeria, and she has worked on international development issues as a consultant for clients, including the United Nations and Commonwealth Secretariat in London. Her teaching interests include a focus on the meanings of inclusive, equitable citizenship in the context of the interplay between globalization, democratization, and economic development. And finally, our research interests include effect of globalization, post-colonialism, and post-modernity on economic and political transformation. Our research interests also include gender, democracy, and citizenship in Africa and African diaspora studies. She is a sole author and editor of 6 books, and she has published book chapters and articles in her areas of research interest. Professor Okome founded #Bring Back Our Guests in New York City, United States of America. She's also the founder and editor of Irinkerindò, a journal of African migration. It's a privilege for me this afternoon to welcome Professor Okome to this webinar. The next on our list is Professor Ayodele Olofintuade. She's an investigative journalist, a researcher who is currently working on queer Yoruba history. She's the author of Lakriboto Chronicle, a brief history of badly behaved women. And this was published in 2018. Her short stories have also been published in several journals. She is the managing director of Niger Feminista, an online feminist and queer magazine. Ayodele lives in a universe populated by the Orisa and Irumole of the Yoruba pantheon. It's a privilege to welcome Ayodele Olofintuade to this webinar. The next on our list is Babatunde Oluajo, who is a former president of the Student Union government at the University of Ibadan. He was awarded a bachelor's and master's degree in political science. He was one of the 2 sub-Saharan Africa representatives on the coordinating committee of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption coalition, where he served for over 3 years. He's currently a board member of the Center for Transparency Advocacy, a civil society advocacy group dedicated to improving the quality of service delivery in Nigeria, and Rule of Law Advocacy and Accountability Center, a civil society organization working on protecting the respect for the rule of law. I have a special pleasure and privilege to welcome Babatunde Oluajo to this webinar. The next is Dr. Adeolu Oyekon, who is an alumnus of the University of Lagos from where he obtained a PhD in philosophy. He has taught philosophy at Lagos State University for over a decade, since 2008. He is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. His research interests include identity politics and conflict management. I'm glad to welcome Dr. Adeolu Oyekon to this webinar. Finally, Professor Peyi Soyinka Airewele is a professor of international and African politics. She's the head of the Department of Political Science at Ithaca College, New York. She served as president of the Association of Third World Studies, co-vice president of the Ithaca City of Asylum, and president of the African Studies and Research Forum. I have a singular honor to welcome Professor Peyi Soyinka to this important webinar. So, president of the Lagos Studies Association, I don't know if the video is available or if we should go straight to the question and answer section. So, if you are there, I'm waiting.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead. Everything is said. We're good.
Okay. So, the first question we are going to pose is going to be arranged in alphabetical order. I mean, the alphabetical arrangement of the names of the panelists. So the first question I'm going to pose is going to Professor Moses Ochonu, and I hope Professor Moses Ochonu is ready right now. So one of the narratives about the current crisis is that previous generation failed the Nigerian youth of today. So if you can cite specific example within your discussion, should, with due respect, sir, should not last for more than 2 to 3 minutes, so that we can manage time and not keep our audience waiting for too long. So if you can cite specific example, do you think that older generations did not do enough to prevent what we have been experiencing in Nigeria since the beginning of this month? So what do you think has changed since young people began to protest police brutality and political misrule since the 1970s? So over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, the organizers, for having me here. It's a pleasure, but also it's also with some distress and a measure of anguish that we have to gather here to talk about this very depressing issue. So to your question, I think that I have to confess that I was one of the people actually who broached this narrative of the older generation probably not doing enough and failing the current generation, thereby necessitating the End SARS movement. But in the last week or so, in the last few days, I've had occasion to reflect more on this question, this particular issue. It seems to me that that narrative is overwrought, and it's a bit unfair on the older generation, it seems to me, because I think that every generation can only act within the circumstances in which it finds itself, within the parameters of the constraints and opportunities presented to it. So previous generation did the best that they could, to fight police brutality and to fight against abuses by security agents within the peculiar constraints of their time. And I think that in a way, the judgment about older generations not doing enough or failing the current generations or setting the stage for these kinds of protests, it can only be retrospective. You can only look back and come to that conclusion, right? In the moment, say in the 70s and in the 80s, when student union leaders, when human rights organizations, especially in the 90s, were fighting against police brutality, were fighting against the apparatuses of cohesion marshaled by the state against them. There were so many blind spots. You know, when you are in the thick of battle, when you are in the trenches, it's hard to see everything that's going on. It's hard to, you are going to make mistakes. You are going to neglect certain aspects of the struggle. In the fog of war, a lot can get lost. And that's why these kinds of protests can only have incremental, accomplishments, and then the next generation will take it up, and it's a continuous process. And the current NSAS movement has shown us that indeed the previous generations did a lot, because they did learn, to the extent that I was one of the people arguing that they didn't repeat some of the mistakes made in the past, right? To that extent, I think they did learn. The older generation did show a path. They did open the way. They opened the door to this current generation to learn a few lessons. One of the previous things that plagued, and some people might argue, doomed the previous protest against police brutality, against tyranny, against oppression generally in society, in Nigerian society, was that all too often movements had leaders who were all too willing to compromise or cave to threats and blackmail and so on and so forth. And the current generation of protesters against police brutality deliberately, as a matter of choice, refuse to have a leadership that is discernible, that is identifiable, that the authorities can either compromise or intimidate into submission, right? The other thing was that the previous generations took for granted that the state would respond responsibly. The current generation learned from that experience, because they saw that the state would always, clamp down hard on these demonstrations. And in this particular, in the case of this current generation, they anticipated the attacks and the threats. And they said, well, we're going to clean up after ourselves so that we're not accused of littering, right? We're going to feed the demonstrators so that they don't abandon the struggle after 1 or 2 hours due to hunger, and so on and so forth. But history tells us that you can do everything right from your perspective. You can do everything within your power, within your capacity, and things could still go wrong, because the state controls has overwhelming control of the apparatuses of cohesion and violence, right? And that is what we saw happen in Lekki and in other places, where the state was able to divide the struggle by sponsoring and mobilizing thugs to infiltrate them. And when that seemed to be failing, they unleashed the infernal machine of repression and violence. And what we saw in Lekki occurred. I'm not going to anticipate the other questions about how to characterize what occurred in Lekki. I'll leave that. I think that's one of the questions we'll get into later. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Moses, for your very interesting analysis. Can we move to Professor Okome for our own insight on the same question? Prof.
Well, I think it's the prerogative of younger generation to give their own unique assessment of historical events, and the ways in which older generations have responded. I have to say that, the older generation is not homogeneous. So within those generations, you have people who have been activists and who have agitated for the progress and development of Nigeria, for democracy, for human rights, and many issues of economic inequality being addressed in a way that privileges the masses of our people. So that has been part of our history. But frankly, there's also within the older generation, this idea that we can pray stuff into oblivion. And that as long as we're praying and fasting, God will make a way. And, there are institutions that we have that foster this kind of magical thinking. Don't get me wrong, I'm a very strong Christian. I believe in the power of prayer. But I also believe that we should, if you're religious, look at the key figures within your religion. They didn't sit down and just pray, they acted. So, this tendency, frankly, irritates me. And I have said so to many people whom I love very much, that we can't just pray things away. You pray, and then you also engage in social action for good. Okay. And then there are also people who have very timid, you know. And I think part of that is because we had those long years of military rule. And it was quite brutal, the way in which the state responded to any attempt to criticize and, you know, engage the state in conversation. So, you know, I think I was a student in the 1970s in the university, and we did participate in protests where people were killed, you know. And before that, I mean, the national, so what this whole situation reminds me of is the history of colonization, the way in which a colonizing force acts. Because yes, the state should have the monopoly over the use of force, but then a democratic state must be willing to engage the population and listen to their concerns. And frankly, also the level of kleptocracy and ineptitude and nonchalance in Nigeria is not in concert with any kind of idea of democracy. So the youth have a responsibility to respond to the issues of the day as they see it. They have the right to criticize what the older generation has done. They also have the responsibility of, you know, mobilizing the kind of protest that is appropriate to their time. So, you know, why would people be offended? You know, nobody's perfect. A lot of mistakes were made in the past, and Professor Ochonu mentioned some of them. People were bought off, people were co-opted, people were, you know, terrorized into silence. So I think the youth are on the right track, and we should allow all these criticisms to happen because that's how we'll grow.
Thank you very much, Ma. I can see a trend emerging now from Professor Ochono's analysis to your own intervention. I can see a trend in terms of the use of force by the state, the attempt by the state to frustrate legitimate and peaceful protests. And you did mention that in the 1970s, even people were killed during the protest. And we have seen cases of killing even in the recent protest. And one thing is also coming out clear, that the youth of today are yearning for a better result. Possibly they think the older generation was unable to achieve better results for our dear country, Nigeria. So can we get the perspective of Ayodele Olofintuade on this matter?
Thank you so much. I've listened to Professor Kome, and I hear what she said. About the older generation or the former protesters or former attempts to change the system. But what I've not heard is an attempt to change the system. The older generation, I'm included somehow. I think I'm one of the lost generations, those that got like missing somewhere in between. They never interrogated the system. And that's the only thing that I've seen that has emerged in all these conversations. Nobody has denied the fact that the Nigerian state has been very, very violent towards not just protesters, but anybody that is different. The Nigerian society, as the systems as it's set up, does not tolerate difference. The Nigerian society does not tolerate being questioned. And the old generation they just bought into it, and what they have done is to replicate it even down to the minutest detail, and that is the family, that's the nuclear family. There is a rigid set of codes that everybody must behave in a certain way, and anybody that goes out of that box, all these boxes that have been built, gets met with violence. So if you look at it from that small unit, what is happening in the larger society, I am not in the least surprised.
Okay. Will you say that
the older generation?
Sorry that I'm interrupting a bit. Will you say that,
yes,
or are you trying to say that the older generation fought and gave up because they did not interrogate the system well enough? Why the new generation is trying to fill in the gap? Okay.
Yes, on. They didn't interrogate the system. They didn't even look at the system as a holistic thing. I remember the first time I protested was during the Occupy Nigeria protest, and we're talking about fuel price hike. And then we're talking about other economic issues surrounding this. And we were met with a lot of force and with a lot of aggression, and people were killed, and people that we saw as leaders were bought off, and that was the end of that. But it went to business as usual. I mean, the generation that then didn't go back to their offices as judicial officers, as secretaries to state house governors, as because we run these systems. None of them went back to say why is this system so violent. We just went back home to sit down.
Okay. Thank you very much. Can we go to Mr. Oluajo now? You were student union president, and talking about the perception of the youth of today about whether that generation has failed them and what has changed since the 1970s in terms of protests against the heel of the state.
I don't think he's here. He's not here.
So we can go to Mr. Oyekon then. Dr. Oyekon, can we have your perspective?
All right. Thank you very much for having me. I think that the proper point from which we should start is to pay tribute to those who organized and then stimulated the series of protests we had recently, and then to once again pause and reflect on the lives we've lost, avoidably so, and then commend the effectiveness of that movement. That said, I will quickly align myself with the position of Professor Oshono, that it is important for us to have some nuance, in as much as we understand that the present generation is so frustrated and annoyed with the situation of things in the country, and justifiably so. However, I do not think that we will be fair to those who have gone or the generations preceding by saying that they did not do enough. I was fortunate to be a student under late Shegun.
Sorry to interject, sir. Hello, I'm sorry to interject. If they did not do enough, how come we still have the crisis of underdevelopment? I mean, if they did enough, don't you think that the fact that the crisis continue to escalate is a reflection of the fact that they didn't do enough?
What we must understand is that bad as the situation is today,
yes,
it can easily be worse. Matter of fact, some people will tell you it is worse than it used to be maybe in the 80s and in the 90s. So we must understand the degeneration of our society and look around us and see some instances where people cannot even come out.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir. Excuse me. It is nothing changed. Nothing is better. There's no worse. It's getting worse and worse. The older generation does not do anything. There's no gain. Not a single thing.
Let me make my point.
Okay, let him make his point, please. Please let him make his point, because both of you are saying the same thing actually. Because he's saying that the past of Nigeria is better than the present of Nigeria. That's summary of his analysis. Am I correct, sir?
The point I'm trying to make is this:
yes.
we will be standing history on its head if we say that the previous generations did not make effort or that they didn't do enough. I was trying to say that the president of the National Union of Nigerian Students as at 1978 was Shegun Okeowo, who later became my principal in secondary school. If you Google the story of Ali Must Go, you will understand the nature of the Nigerian state and how it has consistently repressed people's agitations, how it has always meted brutality on Nigerian citizenry just because people come out to ask for basic rights. And so what we should be saying, what we should be talking about now is how the present generation that has now taken the beating can do it better, given that the circumstances are a little bit different. And then we can build on the progress that the previous generations have made. A society is not made in a day. It is a continuous journey, not a destination. And so we must be mindful of the fact that coming generations will have tools at their disposal that this current generation also does not have. And it will look at that point as if they also didn't do enough, especially if we do not have the type of transformation that we desire now, in spite of our best efforts.
Thank you, sir. We'll come back to a point you made, that what do we need to tell them on how they can do better during the next protest, if possible. So can we move to Professor Peyi Soyinka now for our own intervention on the same question? Older generation versus youth of today, then what has changed since the 1970s in the history of protest in Nigeria?
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I kind of almost get scared sometimes when I hear myself being called professor, because I think, oh my God, now I'm in that older generation. God save me. I think the way I want to think about it is that every generation has to fail the emergent youth. I think it's the nature of the context of changes that each generation faces. I can look back 100 years, and not just in the history of Nigeria, and hear the same discourse, around different areas of struggle, where every generation will necessarily fail the next generation because the context of our lives will change, the nature of power will mutate. And even when you think you've achieved one success in one area, there are 100 other areas that are literally impossible to have tackled because of the depth of the structural problems that we're dealing with. They're structural, they're systemic, they're social, they are ideological, they're deeply philosophical, they're the contention between our culture and what is changing around us. And so for me, I think that the blessing that each generation has is in some ways the mercy of amnesia, because it's overwhelming to kind of look back at some of these overwhelming issues and to think, well, if they fought it and we're still facing it, let's give up. And so when we were in college, we thankfully had some amnesia, because I had no idea what the battles had been in the past. We had a sense of our confidence that we could maybe tackle some of these issues. Moving with the lessons of the past, I think every generation needs to have that merciful oblivion to some of the things that were done in the past and to be able to move on. In Ife, during the SAPS riots, and the various other protests, some of the discourse was about systemic changes. Okay. This was the time when there was still a stronger sense of, the idea that you could topple the system. Socialism was a possibility. You had faculty members who claimed to be communist. And so there was this kind of awareness of the tension between the state we inherited and the capacity to change that. Some of that has become muted, very much so, globally, not just for Nigeria's generation. I think the idea of the triumph of capitalism has served to almost enslave, entire generations, not just the older generation. And so the struggle sometimes seems larger. And I think I just want to mention a couple more things. One is that our discourse should not misread the nature of struggle. These endless cycles remind us that we can never relax. There's no generation that can inherit a platform, a space that is adequately transformed in contending with the violence of the state and of power. The other is the question of the nature of power itself. If this generation succeeds in this particular struggle, power will mutate. It will manifest, like our sister said, Ayodele, it'll finally show its manifestation in other spheres that have been ignored, and it'll constantly, reinforce itself. It will look for co-opting methodologies. It will look for how to assimilate some into its labyrinth of, of power. And, we keep hoping that each generation will not become the cynical generation that will give up. But there was another part to your question, which said, what has changed? And I don't think we've really addressed that.
Before you address that, from what you have said so far, are you saying, will you say that you made a statement that every generation has a responsibility, and in Nigerian history, it appears one generation has failed the next generation. could this be as a result of lack of history teaching in curriculum? Or is it that youth of today do not have enough history of past protests in Nigeria? Just say yes or no and move on to the other point you want to make in brief.
I can't say yes or no because I think, you know, our reading of history is selective. You know, sometimes there's a problem that we don't teach history, but at the same time, each generation is coping with its present moment. And so what we always pick from history, you select sometimes what you need in order to sustain your own struggle for the day ahead. And so that's how every generation does it. You cannot take on the entirety of, you know, the world of the intricate past. You have to take what you have and fight. And that's what they have done. They've selected what they can look at as lessons. They're moving on with it. The only awareness they will have is that in 20 years' time, the emerging youth will tell them, you are the social media generation. You failed us. And so that becomes a reality that is okay. And I think accepting that that is a struggle is also fine. You know,
and we pray that they succeed so that we can rewrite the history of our nation.
Yes, they will succeed, and they are succeeding. I think we just have to measure what we call success. To say success is not creating some kind of utopia. That's not success. The success is legitimately facing a particular hierarchy of struggles and addressing that with all the power and the networks and the resources that they have. And that's what they are doing. And that's what is different. One of the things that's different is that this generation has social media also. It has a different technology. I recall that there were struggles when I was a student. We had not, what was internet? It didn't exist. I never used the word internet in my life, you know. It was, you had activists going by road, you know, traveling. Student unions would send them to Kano, find out what was going on and come back to tell. It's a physicality that's different. And what they have done is to reshape, you know, the struggle and utilize the capacity of that media to create new forms of solidarity and collaboration. And that is something that we have to look at and applaud because they've used their own agency and the technologies available to them to do something that's different and necessary.
Thank you very much. That's brilliant. So this is the end of the first topic. So we are moving to round 2, focusing on the second topic. And I want to seize this opportunity to encourage our participants to use the chat room for now. If you have anything in mind, as the panelists are making their presentations, if you have questions, observations, please begin to engage so that later when we are done, if we still have enough time, we can come back to this. Thank you very much. So I'm going back to Professor Moses Ochonu to address the second topic, which is many people will say that the police is a manifestation of everything wrong about Nigeria. In your own opinion, what do you think is the relationship between policing and the crisis of leadership in Nigeria? So all the panelists will speak on this for 2 to 3 minutes. So we are starting with Professor Moses Ochonu. Over to you, sir.
Yes. So on this particular question, I think it's quite obvious. I mean, the connections are quite obvious in my opinion, because what are the problems of policing in Nigeria? It's a problem of the lack of accountability, a problem of abuse of power. It's a problem of corruption. So all of, you cannot go through any discussion on the problems of the larger Nigerian society or the larger Nigerian state without touching on all of these issues. I can't tell you the number of times when, you know, I've heard these problems mentioned. And these are precisely the same problems that plague the police. And that's not surprising because the police is an appendage of the state. It has always been. And the police is rooted in a colonial conception of policing and control. And after independence, for reasons best known to our so-called founding fathers, they did not see it fit to reform the police so that it gets reimagined as an institution that protects the people rather than the state. That's the fundamental philosophical problem that continues to bedevil the police. And that's also the fundamental problem that plagues the state, the Nigerian state. The Nigerian state sees itself as an entity that stands apart, that stands alone, that stands away from Nigerians, that doesn't require the consent and the support, right? And the contractual participation of Nigerians. So in that sense, the social contract is broken, both between the Nigerian state and its citizens, and between the police and the people that the police is supposed to protect. So you see that the distrust and the breakdown of the relationship between the police and the citizens mirrors the breakdown of the trust between the Nigerian state and Nigerian citizens. So we see it play out on multiple fronts. And it also, kind of illustrates one of the problems that we have been talked about widely as the problem of the Nigerian state, which is that if you empower a group of people, right, even whether they're in the National Assembly, whether they're in the military or in the executive arm of government, and you do not check their power, you do not hold them accountable, you unleash them on the Nigerian population, it's a human tendency to abuse that power, to abuse that privilege. And that is what we are seeing in the police, especially with SARS, that particular unit of the Nigerian police force. They were never subjected to the kind of direct control, the kind of direct jurisprudential control or constraints that other police units have been subjected to. In other words, we created this monster and simply unleashed it on the Nigerian state, right? Kind of similar, analogous, in my opinion, to a lot of political operatives, really, who have basically carved out niches and estates for themselves, and they do as they please. And Abuja cannot hold them accountable. Governors cannot hold such people accountable. And to me, just this for all exercise of power is unchecked. And so, yes, the connection is very obvious to me between what plagues the police and what plagues the Nigerian state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. From your analysis, it's clear that you said police is an appendage of the state, meaning the state is using the police as an instrument to achieve some objectives. So what quickly arises from your analysis is, I want to ask you, how well is the government taking care of this appendage? And the responsibility of the government, according to the Constitution, Section 14 subsection 2, there are two fundamental issues: security and welfare of the citizen. So that's the primary role of the government. So from your experience, what do you think? Do you think, let's start from the police now, maybe you can just speak in one sentence. Is the government able to provide adequate security for the police? And is government able to provide adequate welfare for the police to start with? Because if you have a child and you do not take care of your child and you send your child on errand, what kind of performance do you expect from an hungry child that is sent on errand? So over to you, Prof.
I want to say something that might be a bit controversial and something quite radical, which is that there is an unwritten rule, an unwritten understanding that underpins this relationship between the police and the state. You know, they are mutually reinforcing, and they have this symbiotic relationship. I'm a historian, so in colonial times, there were this group of people that were called Sojangona in northern Nigeria. It literally means a soldier of the farm. These groups of people were not the part of the official army or the police, but there was an understanding between them and the state, and they were basically authorized to go out there and collect revenue, right? With the understanding that some of that revenue they could keep for themselves. So I invoke that to try to explain the relationship that exists between the Nigerian police and the Nigerian state. It's not so much that it's deliberate, it's a deliberate policy, in my opinion, that they are not taking care of them, to use your language, right? But also there's an understanding that the police can take care of themselves by extorting citizens, by engaging in extrajudicial means of revenue generation, by doing those kinds of things that we've come to condemn under the rubric of NSAS. So that's how I'm going to answer that question.
Thank you. Very, very, very well. So that means, therefore, that there's no excuse for any form of brutality or abnormality, since there's understanding between the state and the police on how things should be properly done. But I want to believe that that's not the situation in other countries where police are well organized and well equipped. So we'll come back to this. So can we move to Professor Okome on the same topic, ma'am?
I've been itching to actually interrupt. Are you saying that that the police is separate from the state? You know, the police are agents of the state.
That's what he said.
You
use the word
the way
appendage.
you're asking your question, sir, it seems like we're making a separation between the state and the police. The police is part of the state.
Yes, sure.
It is an expression of the way in which the state wants to manage law and order. Okay. And this idea that we have some nirvana somewhere, I mean, I'm living in the US, the police is brutal and violent towards Black people. Okay, so in Nigeria, the police is most brutal with poor people. And then anybody that is declared an enemy of the state. And there's a historicity to this. You know, the roots of our state is colonial. So the way in which the colonialists were acting that we objected strenuously to, the Nigerians campaigned against, that we said when independence comes, we're not going to do what they were doing. We're doing exactly that. And you know, if you've been reading the papers, you saw that Britain helped to train SARS, okay? Yes. Gave them equipment, okay? So we have a new colonial state. We are not independent yet. Yeah. Independence is yet to come. So I can understand the agitation of the youth. But let's not believe that the police in the United States is better and in the UK, they are humane and whatever. The police can be very brutal. That's the meaning of state, okay? The legitimate right to use force. And when they declare that you are an enemy to them, they will use that force against you. Now, the essence of democracy is that people will push back and say, no, we are citizens. The social contract between us and you in a democracy is that clause that you were mentioning in the Constitution. We insist on this. You know, so I think one of the things that's frustrating to me is that people think that democracy is a spectator sport. You just go and vote and then you go home and all those people, they will give you what you need. They won't. It is always a struggle and nothing can be gained without struggle. If you have decent democracies in this world, blood has been shed to accomplish it. I'm not, you know, I'm a pacifist. I don't need bloodshed. I hate violence. But let's be clear, states are violent forces, okay? And the reason why they are violent is that, you know, they protect the interest of the elites. And if you have a neoliberal, so, you know, I was saying that we have history. We fought against SAP. People died for that, okay? Now, we cannot measure whether people have sacrificed or worked or struggled by the fact that we have perfection. So let's not forget all those fights. Because if we forget, we're going to make the same mistakes. And then not everybody is a sellout. So when you are fighting the police, you're fighting the state. And that's why they send all the bazookas to come and get you, to intimidate the rest of the population into quietude. And so these are battles that, you know, the more mature democracies fought in the past. Some of them are still fighting against parts of their population. Like in the US, the whole essence of the Black Lives Matter movement is that the police is acting like an occupation force against African Americans, you know, and that you are fair game. Because if they shoot you dead, nothing will even happen to them, you know, in terms of prosecution. So let us also realize that there are elements of many of the things we're experiencing that are being experienced in other parts of the world. Okay. And it is, you know, the contention that should be made is against these violent expressions of the state. To remind the state that without the consent of the people, the state is worth nothing, you know, and then there's the negotiation. So, you know, the state is the police is the state.
Thank you very much, Prof. So your intervention is quite revealing. And with your reference to other countries where police brutality is a problem, you mentioned the United States, and that's quite correct, because the Black Lives Movement protest, which was successful in the US, also was part of the background for NSAS movement in Nigeria, because our youth of today are technologically inclined and they are watching what is happening in different parts of the world. And to buttress your point further, according to literature, from 2013 to 2019, about 7,666 deaths were attributed to police brutality in the United States alone. So other countries like South Africa, Asia, India also have their cases. But the question is, how do we solve the problem in Nigeria? So we want to go to the next intervention now from Ayodele Olofin Tuade. Over to you, ma'am.
Very much. I'm still going back to what I was saying earlier about the fact that we're all complicit, because we keep talking about the fact that, like all these apparatuses are just like, they are independent of us or of our subtle support. It's not even subtle, it's overt. Somebody owes you money, an average Nigerian will go to the police and get the person arrested extrajudicially, and they arrest the person and they put the person in prison without any due process. And we keep acting like we don't know that we live in a police state. And we keep acting like there aren't layers of violence on this violence that we're talking about. And this is where you're missing it. The people that are on the streets right now are not just fighting against the state, they're also fighting against their parents who have used violence against them over the years. Emotional, physical, and we keep distancing ourselves and acting brand new, like the government came from Mars and they're not part of us. Buhari is doing exact thing that the father of a nuclear family is expected to do. When your children are misbehaving and they're asking you questions to respond with violence, we have to understand that we are complicit, and we'll have to start healing from there, and we'll have to start going back. Lecturers harass students in schools. We don't talk about that level of violence. They don't allow students to have student union governments in universities. So why are we on this panel? I don't understand. We're talking about we're all, the government. It's not just the government. And that was what I was referring to earlier when we were talking about the older generation. The older generation are not just like innocent bystanders. They're not just people that suffered from state-sanctioned violence. They themselves have been perpetrating violence against other people, and they're complicit in so many layers and so many levels. Feminist coalition funded weeks of this protest. There was ambulance, there was legal aid, do you know what is happening now? There are men, Nigerian men, on Twitter right now attacking women in feminist school because men expect women to perform labor for them and not to take any pride in their work. So when you're talking about violence, when you're talking about state-sanctioned violence, you have to also examine your own violence and how you have been complicit in this police state that we're living in, because every family unit in Nigeria is a police state on its own. It's a police local government.
Thank you very much for this comment. You are taking policing to a broader perspective, starting from the family, and that's quite correct. And on this note, I want you to look at this. Every society needs policing. What I believe you are trying to say is that...
I'm sorry, I do not agree with you that every society needs policing. I totally disagree with that. I believe that the police... Because within chaos is order. You do not have to control it. You do not have to control people to have order. Within chaos, stop thinking in this police. I believe the police should be abolished.
Thank you, Ayodele. Thank you so much. I think we should stick to the program. I think we should take the questions one at a time, and then allow the panelists to speak one at a time. Once we're done, I think we can go back to then exchanging of ideas. But I just want us to finish the questions and stick to exactly the mission of this program. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for that comment. So on that note, can we move to the next panelist to make his presentation? Dr. Adeolu.
All right. Yeah, I think that by design, a policing system is part of the structures of the state. And so necessarily you will see the police in every society mirroring the political leadership at every point in time. But if you interrogate it further, you will see that in most societies, we have the political elite who have their own agenda and then who have their own interest and then who use state institutions to further those interests. From the colonial period, as we've heard and as we all know, the Nigerian police has been designed in such a way that its sole function is to preserve the privileges of the political elite. And those who inherited powers from the colonial masters did not make any effort to transform it because they didn't see it as being in their own interest to do so. They had their own tussles, and the understanding was if I control the power at the federal, if I control power at the federal level, I will be able to control the police and also use it against my enemies. Do not forget all that happened with Obafemi Awolowo and then the ruling party. So the Nigerian police essentially has been a reflection of the type of leadership that we have had. Although there is a different school of thought, or let me say slightly different school of thought, that feels that the Nigerian police has actually been a victim of successive leadership, especially during the military the military rulerships that we have, such that in those days we saw a situation in which the army tried to project itself as a normal institution of governance and then relegated all the other institutions of state. So in a sense, you can try a little bit to balance it and say that yes, the Nigerian police mirrors the successive leadership that we have had, but in a way, it is also a victim of that leadership. But then again, we must make the point to drive it home that leadership is core to what we are discussing, that the decay that we see in the Nigerian police is not peculiar to that institution alone. The reason why we notice it is because, one, it has the power of force, and two, it is a very visible institution. If you are not an importer and you don't deal in cars, you don't sell turkey, you don't sell, you don't take rice in from Cotonou, you may not experience the brutality of the Nigerian customs, but the Nigerian custom can be as brutal as the Nigerian police. If you go to some of our communities in those areas that border our neighbors, they will tell you the horrors that they go through in the hands of the Nigerian custom. And so you can look around and see numerous institutions of state that do not function well, that make Nigerians go through numerous harrowing experiences. But those institutions you will see always have a way of catering to the interest of the minority who control the levels of power at different layers. So if we can say, yes, the Nigerian police is a mirror of the type of leadership we have, but it's also a mirror of the structure and the system of the state that we operate. Because
thank you very much, sir.
The system and the structure permits the kind of leadership that we have, and the kind of leadership that we have makes the kind of the policing system that we have to be the kind of system that panders to its own interest.
Good, thank you. Will you say that solving the problem of policing in Nigeria should begin from solving the crisis of leadership?
Well, we have to start somewhere, but my hunch is that if we solve the problem, if we try to solve the problem of
can you address policing problem without addressing leadership problem? That's the question. Since you have already connected the policing and the leadership.
it will not go far enough. It may bring about some changes. And
which one will not go far?
If we address the policing problem
without addressing leadership problem, okay.
Without addressing the leadership problem,
thank you very much, sir.
Enough. Yeah.
Okay.
But
thank you.
If we want to be holistic about it, we must be able to reform the police, reform the system of leadership, and then we will see.
And that will then inform the
policing
that the state that will work well for the state. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So over to you, Professor Soyinka. Still on the same issue.
Thank you. This has been so interesting. And I love being the last because
yes.
I can just actually relax and say, as you all said. And
okay, if you want to say that, like, may I, because I have a challenge from essentially discussions. So I want you to look at it.
No, that's not what she wants to say. She wants to talk. Oh.
Okay.
I do want to talk. Thank you.
Okay.
One of the things that I thought you covered beautifully was the historical, the structural location of the police in our colonial history. And I just want to really affirm that. I think you brought it out very beautifully, Professor Okome and Professor Ochono. Thank you for that. The state was wrought in violence. The police forces that we have at the moment, both the military as well as the police, are complicit, no doubt, in those and part and parcel of those state systems of governance. The colonial state was essentially a state of violence, and so had to create a police force to maintain itself. And that itself had given us the legacy of an imagination of the police as both being part of the state, embedded in the state, but there to protect and shelter the state. So there's that dilemma that already has been brought out. The other dilemma that I wanted to really focus on, I thought Ayodele did a fantastic job in raising the idea of societal complicity in violence. That for me is really when you're thinking about leadership and what are the institutions of leadership. It's not just national leadership. It's not just state. It's not just local government. It's also about social leadership. It's the institutions, how we govern them, where people's everyday experiences with violence are governed and led. The police are intimately involved in those systems. And some of it comes from what we inherit from the state and how we are trained, and we receive that as a normalization of our relationship with power. And some of it comes from cultural norms, traditions, and so on and so forth, which we're struggling, and the youth are very much part of every youth generation of challenging that, or imagining, how do we do that? And so in some ways, I see the police as they're in this boundary line between the society and, whatever we imagine as power, many different forms of power. And within the society, I also see this culture of fear and disdain. There are elements in the society that are anxious about the police, and there are others who hold them in disdain. We also see them as tools we use. So there are everyday forms in which we are implicated in using the police also to maintain local forms of terror. We use them for convoys. We use them to terrorize our tenants, if need be. We use them sometimes to, teach our kids a lesson. I've been involved in situations where a neighbor, friends would say to the local police, could you keep my son for overnight to teach him a good lesson? And so there's that whole transaction going on between how the society uses the police. So at the same time, they're embedded within us in an unhealthy way, and within the state in a very unhealthy manner. And to that sense, I think what Professor Oyekon was saying, about examining the police itself as, almost who are also victims in some ways of these forms of violence between the state and the society. We have to look at that. How do we transform, if possible, if ever possible, that system? And how do we transform it at our own local level? I think it's a huge question. We don't have easy answers to it, but I do appreciate what all the panelists have said so far.
Thank you very much, Prof. You have brought out clearly the synergy between the states, the police agency, and the public. Because without the approval of the public, the police cannot function. So in resolving whatever problem, therefore, the public has a role to play, because if the public does not accept the political elite and also accept the police agency, definitely the police cannot function. So, and I think that is where the youth protest NSAS movement comes into play. But when we interrogate what has happened so far and the approach and what could have been done better, maybe in subsequent topic that we are going to address today, we can. I'm just, your analysis has brought out this perspective really, because you have hit the nail on the head. State on one side, the police on another side, then the public on another side. The public, you see the police for different reasons, different categories of the public are using the police, and the public is not homogeneous. You have different categories of persons in the public, and each category has different understanding of the functions of the police, and so on and so forth. And irrespective of the category, the policy is supposed to be for everybody. It's not supposed to be for VIP. It's not supposed to be for landlord alone. And most especially, the focus should be more on the ordinary citizens, the powerless members of the states who really need protection. So thank you very much for your intervention. This will take us to the topic 3. And I want to remind the participant again to use the chat room. Whatever comes to your mind, please write it down before you forget. Thank you very much. So Professor Ochonu, Professor Moses Ochonu, I want to begin with you. The politics of naming violence now. Looking back to events of October 2020, in your opinion, what is the best name or nomenclature for that event? Do you agree there was a massacre based on the evidence available in the public domain? Professor Ochonu.
Yes, thank you. Listen, I mean, I think the naming game is one that is, it's not as, I mean, it's not very productive to get bogged down by this debate over naming. In some ways, it's a dead-end debate. And I've been very frustrated by social media debates about how many people died, how did they die, and questions about, okay, did the army shoot the victims, did the police? I mean, it's kind of like the pidgin English saying that we grew up with. You know, they say Reverend Father die. You can't sit up, you can't ask say in Bia, say Reverend Father born. You can't ask say in Bia follow born. You know, that for me, it doesn't take us to a lot of places. You know, this morning before I logged onto this Zoom conference or webinar, I just read a brand new report, very detailed, by Premium Times, one of Nigeria's most respected investigative journalistic outfits, detailing the events that occurred, the tragic, very tragic, heartbreaking, depressing events that occurred, you know, in Lekki. They took photographs. I mean, they are visual, there's a lot of visual evidence, there's photographic evidence, video evidence, it's all there. And there's eyewitness account. There's no question that a massacre occurred. And there's also no question that an elaborate cover-up has occurred, or it's actually ongoing as we speak, right? But there's a lot of things that have been, there are a lot of things that have been covered up in terms of, you know, accounting for the victims, those who have been injured, those who were maimed, those who were killed. We don't have an accurate, precise number yet. But that doesn't negate the fact that a massacre did occur. And I think we let's be careful so that we don't fall into the trap of power, because nothing serves power more than obfuscation and confusion and indeterminacy. So once we get caught up in this debate about, is it a massacre? How many people died? How did they die? How can we, I think we get bogged down by what Uyimbo people call analysis paralysis, that we don't recognize, we run the risk of not recognizing the enormous human tragedy that unfolded at Lekki, and not just at Lekki, but at other places around the country, you know, as a result of the NSAS movement. But the final thing I'm going to say is that I want to make sure that we assign culpability precisely, because this debate can take us away from that crucial issue. Because we have to ask the question, who derailed the protest, the peaceful protest? It's the government, right? Who mobilized thugs? Who mobilized violent actors to infiltrate these groups? who unleashed them on the peaceful protesters, who called upon the army to intervene, who called upon the police. So all of those questions lead to the state. So I don't want this debate, as important as it is to account for what happened, to have a precise picture. I don't want it to lead us away from the site of culpability, which for me personally, I locate firmly within the realm of the state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's apt.
Sorry, moderator.
Yes, that's excellent.
Sorry,
Yes.
moderator. Could we ask the president maybe to activate the chat for participants? I believe only the Q&A is open to them.
Yes. The chat room is also working. I have 23. I can see 23 chats already in the chat room.
The panelists, I think, are able to put things in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Participants are not. Is that deliberate?
The president, can you please look into that quickly, please?
I'm trying to do it, but it seems I would have to stop the entire event to be able to do it. So
it's
if
violent.
Can you please just post whatever you have in the question and answer, and people would see it.
Well, I think alternative is that we have to allow people to raise their hand later then, if they cannot use the chat room for now.
Let's go on.
Okay.
Because I don't think we should stop
Work
the
those
program.
logistics out later, behind the scenes.
Okay,
so we are not cutting into the time.
Over to you, Professor Chono. I mean, Professor Okome, yes.
You just like Professor Chono, and I'm feeling gender bias. Okay.
I
like everyone.
I agree. I agree
Nonetheless,
with Professor
I shall speak. Now, you know what? Okay, so the essence of the whole massacre thing, are we going to talk about killing people who are helpless, who are not resisting, with an atrocious amount of cruelty and overwhelming force as the important thing when we think about massacre? Or we want to be counting the number of people? So, you know what? You, the moderator, you kuku read us the Constitution, the part that says the welfare, protection, well-being of our Nigerian people is the primary responsibility of the state. Now, this same state, which says that it respected that Constitution when the officials were sworn in they disabled cameras. They turned off light. They started shooting at helpless people. I dare say for me, it's a massacre, okay? Because no state worth its salt. And I do know that I've said that the state is violent, but there are standards, because we are now in the 21st century. And there are standards that all states have said they subscribe to, especially the ones that say they're democratic. Yeah. Our state has violated those standards by turning the guns. I know it has happened in the past. When it happened in the 1970s and during colonialism, it was people who had suspended the constitution, or we didn't have a constitution. We were not even recognized as citizens under colonialism. Now we are recognized as citizens. We have a constitution. It is imperfect, though, like all constitutions. And the Constitution says defend and protect us. And then you send people with guns to go and kill innocent, peaceful protesters. Plus, you know, another element of all this violence that I find disturbing is our tendency in Nigeria to use thugs to intimidate and to oppress people who dare to cross us when we have power. So there are politicians who also use thugs. I don't know, you know, the story is not clear to me now who did what, which is the whole purpose of the commissions of inquiry. But the thing is, people were killed. And it is so annoying. It is disappointing. It is reprehensible for the state to be claiming that nothing happened. So I just want to say, for me, until they show me otherwise, they have to prove that they're innocent. Okay, I take them as guilty because they sent people to shoot. And some of the people who asked for the army to come, they have been saying they did it. The governor of Lagos State said, I sent for them, but I don't know how they do their work. And kinikon. Okay. So look, and like Professor Ochano said, this did not only happen, the killings of innocent protesters didn't only happen in Lagos, in Lekki. We are hearing more about Lekki because, frankly, Lekki is a more privileged space than our places where poorest people congregate. So, the use of violence, look at the slum removals they've done in Lagos. Look at the ways in which when people are fighting over land, everybody brings their thug. So I also want to say that Ayodele is making some good points. Yes. I just don't believe that we are all the same violent people, but there are norms that people are silent about, about the use of violence, about kangaroo justice, about, if you have any conflict with people, everybody is actually very happy when you show that you have power by inflicting violence. And then I want to say that the use of violence, the use of naked force is actually not power. Sure. It is a weak state that acts in this way, because the essence of democracy is that you are going to sit down and negotiate things, even difficult situations. And that's why you have these demands being made wherever state violence manifests itself. What I don't want anybody to believe is that, oh, we are violent and the Americans are not. We are violent and the British are not. Everybody, all the states are violent, and that's why you have brave, courageous people bringing these claims and saying, no, we are not going to have it. And in Nigeria too, I want to say, I'm on the side of the youth. We are not going to have it. Enough of the violence, and then enough of normalizing violence in our society. We can do better than this. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Can we go to Dr. Ayodele Olofintuade? Qualities of naming your own intervention.
Not a professor. I'm just Ayodele. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay. Professor on the Lekki event of October 20.
All right. I'd like to point out that what happened on 2010-20, we are just anchoring it on Lekki. It was a nationwide, it was a deliberate, well-planned nationwide assault on protesters. I was violently kidnapped off the streets of Ibadan on that same day. And earlier that day, they had gone and shot people at Ojo. So, and I've got reports from other parts of the country where protesters are, and I've been told that people were killed all across the country on that day. And it wasn't even in Lagos alone. In other parts of Lagos, people were killed. The government of Nigeria is a criminal organization that sends out the army to kill people on the streets. They are people that are saying, stop killing us. The government responded by killing, not just killing us. Right now, we are under military regime because we can't go out without raising our hands up. It happened to me yesterday.
Really?
And
at what time? Was it during the curfew?
No, there's no curfew in Ibadan, but if I go out of my house now and I move a bit down the road and I reach a major, there are army officers there, and they require you to raise up your hand. And if you are on Okada, you're required to get off the Okada and walk with your hands up in the air. And if you're in a car, you're required to, like all the passengers in the car, are required to raise up their hands.
You know why that is happening?
And because they are unleashing psychological warfare on us, because they have unleashed physical violence. And that is why I said what happened on 2010-20 is not some random thing that happened just at Lekki. It was a well-planned, planned military incursion, and it was aimed at Nigerian citizens to shut us up. still under military rule presently. Nigeria is operating under whatever law. I have no idea. I think they call it some kind of weird law. I don't know. I'm not really a very learned person, like in when it comes to academics. But this is what they are doing to us right now. We are being assaulted psychologically. We have army on the streets with caning people for not raising up their hands.
That's in Ibadan.
So,
okay.
Yes, that's not just in Ibadan, all over Nigeria, even in Lagos, it's happening. It's happening everywhere. I get updates from across the country, and that is what is happening right now, presently, as we're talking. People are not talking about it because they don't want to give it a lot of, they don't want to give them power to intimidate us, because we're not going to give them that platform to intimidate us further. Where I'm going is like what happened on 2010-20, the Lekki massacre is the anchor. What they did is like they took people nationwide, but they targeted poor communities and then killed a middle class community to drive their point home that there are no sacred goats or sacred cows or sacred pigs. I don't know. Okay. I mean, that was their intention, and it was a well-planned intention. And that's all I have to say on that. About nomenclatures, I don't know why it's so important, but there was a massacre. And it's called the Lekki massacre. And it was not limited to Lekki. It was a nationwide massacre of people who are asking not to be violated.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Oyekon, what do you think on the same issue?
I think that we will be limiting the gravity of what has happened and what is still happening in some areas of Lagos and other parts of the country where the protests took place. If we restrict ourselves to what happened in Lekki, in the very early days of this protest, people were shot in Ogbomoso, people were shot in Ibadan. We saw videos. These were harmless protesters who were killed. As the protest progressed, we saw coordinated attacks in Abuja. The Nigerian police brutalized people. The Nigerian army did brutalize people in front of the National Assembly. And then they graduated to hiring thugs to attack some of these protesters. Some of them were driven to the venues of this protest, both in Lagos and in Abuja, in vehicles suspected to belong to the state. You saw people in expensive SUVs driving hoodlums to protest venues, to go and beat people up. Some of these protesters died. So what happened in Lekki it can be described as the culmination of the exercise of the brute force of the state. So if we take all of this cumulatively, I do not have much problems with those who have weaponized the use of the word massacre to call attention, both within the country and outside of it, to the inordinate use of power by the Nigerian state. And we must emphasize the fact that that use was deliberate, it was calculated, and it was graduated. And so the Nigerian state committed further atrocities against its citizens in a bid to show that it is not yet ready to accede to the legitimate demands of the people to reform the police. And so we must continue to make that point. And it shows us that the Nigerian government is not ready to actually reform the police beyond what we've been hearing over the last 4 years. So while I also do not want to be drawn into what name to give what we have seen, I think that the word massacre serves a functional purpose, which is to draw attention to what the government is trying to cover up. Because what they told us after that evening was that the army was never at Lekki. Eventually, they walked it back. They now admitted they were there, but they didn't fire any gunshots. Now we are hearing that gunshots were fired, but those weren't live bullets. And so if we didn't keep this narrative going, it would have been very easy for the Nigerian state to sweep this under the carpet. And it is because people continue to talk about it, they continue to ask questions, that some of the revelations that we are seeing now are beginning to manifest. So for me, I think it is okay within this particular context to continue to weaponize that, because in actual fact, we do not know what has happened. We have been told by numerous witnesses that bodies were taken away. And so if we have not tallied all of these, and the government is trying to change the narrative, oh, just admit that we didn't have a massacre. And if you admit that we didn't have a massacre, nothing happened. I think it is important for us to resist this until we have a very clear picture of what happened, not only in Lekki, but in other places where Nigerians were brutalized for exercising their rights.
Thank you very much. Professor Soyinka, what do you think?
Thank you. I think I really struggle with the very fact that we are the protesters, the NSAS movement has been placed in the dock to have to justify in any way the use of a particular language. And I think if we interrogate the very word, I think for me it's troubling, massacre. The idea that there's a pressure to whether justify whether or not there was a massacre is kind of problematic, because in many ways it goes back to a larger problem about the fact that Black struggles and the death of Black people is rendered illegitimate if it does not arouse horror by little bands of people overseas, or by institutions, or by the global media that doesn't care anyway about our Black bodies. And I think there's a danger of having to feed into this space of racist inscription of difference. You know, there is, I think, for me, a sense that until the world hears that we died en masse, that there were hundreds of thousands of Nigerians lying on the streets, then it doesn't matter that we died. And this is one of the dilemmas we face, that in some ways, when you are transmitting the reality of a struggle, of your suffering, of state terrorism, when it comes to Black people, we have to capture it somehow in a visual manner that says that we died in our multitudes. Why is it that we can go on the streets in the US, in England, and protest the life of one person who is killed by police brutality, that the world knows the name of that one person? But when it comes to Nigeria, we have to first say, was it a massacre? Was it not a massacre? Where are the bodies? Where are not the bodies? We know what was faced. And I think one of the challenges we fight is psychologically, as protesters ourselves, we have to convince ourselves that we do not have to first be massacred for the battle to be legitimate. It is legitimate. It is real. And one of the things is, I think, see it as the anxiety of the post-colony, the idea that we need this global attention. Well, unfortunately, global attention has never served to really help us change anything structurally within. So far, they have not really helped us. And if we allow the government to win this stupid battle over nomenclature, rather than being able to self-name what has happened, as we did in the beginning, we feed into a diversion of the real purpose. Why were they on the streets? They were on the streets because they were protesting a long history of police brutality. We were fighting against torture chambers, against disappearances, against the silencing of men, women, and children. That matters. And we cannot lose sight of that battle. That was the battle that allowed these people to die, young people to die on the streets, because it was already there. The state terrorism, the killings, the shooting, the torture, the painful testimonies matter. Each of those testimonies itself is a huge indictment on the state. We have to bring out those stories again to remind ourselves and the government about why the NSAS struggle was there. So I think it's important to talk about the massacre, about sporadic, isolated struggles that happened. But more than that, we have to be aware that nothing is reduced without the language of a massacre. That very often, those who demand that you be massacred before they listen to you are those who don't even care about your Black body in the first place. And I refuse to be part of feeding into that need, because too much has happened, too much is legitimate of what we're fighting for, and we need to stand on that.
Thank you very much. So all the panelists seems to have a common understanding and agreement on what happened on the 20th of October. So that will take us to the next topic, starting with Professor Ochonu. The hoodlums that contaminated the peaceful protest now. So in your own opinion, what do you have to say? How did what began as a peaceful agitation led to jailbreak and destruction of private and public properties? Do you think violence was politicized to discredit leaders in their respective location? And do you think the violence has discredited the legitimate agitation of Nigerians? Professor Ochonu. So let's use 1 to 2 minutes now, because in order not to keep our participants waiting for too long, and we are drawing close to the conclusion of the webinar. So, Professor Ochonu, are you with us?
I'm here.
Okay, sir.
Yeah, I'm here.
Just within 1 to 2 minutes.
Yeah. I think, again, we should be mindful of how certain narratives are put in the public domain to distract, to discredit, and to delegitimize. And I think this is one of those narratives, the idea of hoodlums, taking over the protests and, discrediting the protest. I mean, it served the interest of the state. It served the interest of certain politicians to push that narrative as a way of, deflecting attention from their own culpability, from their own refusal to accede to the demands of the youth, and also to distract from the violent crackdown that they authorized, right? So there's no question that when you have mass actions of this type in any society, it's not just Nigeria, by the way, in the West, wherever, you are going to have a few mavericks who are going to run off on their own and do things that are unpalatable, and that may even undermine the central goals and aspirations of the movement, the larger movement. That's not new. That has always been part of every protest movement, every revolutionary movement, every movement of dissent that challenges authority are going to have that. The mistake that we could make is to elevate that above the legitimate struggle, so that we ultimately will lose sight of what necessitated the struggle in the first place, which is police brutality, which is the abuse of citizens, so I don't want to glamorize, and I don't want to dignify this narrative too much. I know that it's going to be part of the repertoire, the discursive repertoire now. Whenever these protests are discussed, the role of hoodlums are going to be discussed. But we have to be mindful of even that term hoodlum is loaded, and we need to be mindful of how certain actors, self-serving actors, are deploying that narrative of hoodlums, that term hoodlums, to discredit legitimate protest against the state and against its abuses. That is what I'm going to say. Let me just leave it there, and other people.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's apt. Let's go to Professor Okome. Over to you, ma'am.
So who are the hoodlums? The people who stole Nigerian money are sitting there, sending police, sending soldiers to go kill people. Listen, are people supposed to starve to death in Nigeria? I do not condone violence. But violence, the kind of violence that has been underway in Nigeria is structural violence. Structural violence normalizes the trauma that poor people experience on a daily basis. It legitimizes why some people should have their private planes and other people do not have 2 kobo to rub together. And yet, it also legitimizes people who are in government, who are supposed to be stewards of the collective property. Somebody needs to mute their mic. The collective property of all Nigerians, they have stolen it. And then they are complaining that people are going to steal Indomie, Abi. And then also, I think we need forensic investigation in Nigeria to get to the bottom of who sent the thugs, okay? Because there are also people who, because they really have nothing doing, they don't have any way of making money, they are available to be hired to inflict violence on other people. This is also a function of structural violence, that you have made people's lives so terrible, that just for the price of a meal, and a little left over, they can go and kill for you. So we set this system in motion that legitimizes violence. And that violence is turning on us, and we need to realize the complicity of the state, because of the massive plunder of Nigerian resources that has started the lives of Nigerians for this. We also need to realize that, you see, you quoted the Constitution. What does it mean? That the welfare of the Nigerians are the responsibility of the government.
Sure.
And the government has been missing in action on this. So people should not complain. If we don't want a violent system, we need to respect democratic principles. And they have to be felt by people, not just words we are spouting. When people buy into this, you're going to see a change in demeanor, in behavior, in attitude. So the state-inflicted violence itself, then there's the structural violence because of the way we have made it normal for some people to just starve to death. They shouldn't complain, just be praying and fasting. And then, the way in which some of us can go and hire hungry people and say, go and beat up these people for me. And they, because that's the only way they are going to make money, they'll do it. We built a political economy of violence. We have structural violence just legitimized, And I dare say, Ayodele, although I kind of want to make a more nuanced thing about all of us are complicit, a lot of us love kangaroo justice. So this is what the bed we made. We are going to lay on it very uncomfortably until all of us realize that we have to rebuild a compassionate system that honors the trust that people have given to the people in government to manage our common patrimony and matrimony, and use our resources for us, not for them and their children and their friends. This is what people are complaining about. If people are going and just wrecking, during colonial times, there were people who went and broke down all the things of the state because they didn't buy into this state and what it stood for. So we need to listen. People are talking, and sometimes they talk through action. I don't condone it, but if people don't buy into a system, they will destroy it. The system doesn't care about Nigerians.
Thank you very much, ma'am. We really appreciate that beautiful analysis. Professor Soyinka, what's your own contribution to that? You think the violence and destruction of private and public properties discredits the leaders in their various locations, and did that discredit the legitimate agitation of Nigerian youth?
I see you decided to shake it up a little bit, huh?
No, still the same narrative.
No, I hear you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
You said keep it to 1 minute. I think, just clearly we have in the aftermath of the struggle, of the initial splendidly organized mobilization and the protest that was really unprecedented in many ways in its form of organization, the feeding, the charging stations, the water, the medical stations, and so on. Everything Professor Okome said about the impact of structural violence in the society impacting us is clear. I feel there was some state-sponsored organization of violence going on there. We had access, we saw videos that showed, security forces picking up young men who are disaffected and, taking them ostensibly to help create trouble in the streets. So there's no doubt. And this often happens. We anticipate this, we see it all the time, where the state perpetually tries to sow particular fracture of well-organized, protests to kind of divert that protest itself. But of course, like Professor Okome said, when it happens in a context where people are disaffected, they're fed up, there's actually no sense of a community with the so-called state or a sense of belonging or ownership of the properties, then it does mean that you can expect the kind of expulsion, of rage, of anger that, happens. There were two types of things that I saw. One was the looting category, and then there was the burning. And they say two different things. Looting speaks to a particular kind of a crisis, and burning speaks to a different kind of purpose. Some of the burning, I think, was done by sponsored agitators, and others was done by people to say, this is the symbol of what you're holding as your power and authority and of wealth over us, then let it go. And I think we're going to have to accept that that will be a part of protest for a long time to come, both in Nigeria, we saw it in the US, and that it will be used as a weapon against protesters. It's really holding strong and reiterating your purpose, continuing our mobilization through that, knowing that it is the job of the government to be able to begin to look at how to restore a sense of belonging in the society. And I would just encourage those who are, leading the demonstrations and the protests, is you've got to keep steadfast and not to feel that you are the one in the dock. Yeah, the one who has to explain all of it. That's not our job to have to handle all of that. It's our job to continue to maintain, the truth of what is happening in the society at the moment. So like I said, I think it's going to become a normal part of struggles for a long time to come, that there will be these, both the looting as well as burnings. And that is an indictment on the society and where it is at the moment and the state.
Thank you very much. So we are moving to the last topic now for the panelists, which is about the way forward. And we are starting with Professor Ochonu. So the last topic now is about the way forward. So what step do you think we need to take, and who should take that step to manage this situation right now? And how should the government tackle future agitation? Over to you, Professor Ochonu.
Quite simply, we need more transparency on the part of government, and no government in any part of the world accedes to transparency without being pushed. So we need more civil society actions. I like to say that people within the country who are in the trenches and are organizing, they face significant existential risks to their persons, to their families, when they undertake these kinds of activities, when they pressure the government to do the right thing. I think it behooves those of us who are outside the shores of the country. We do have a certain cachet, we do have a certain distance from the risks involved. We have to speak up whenever we get a platform, whenever we get a chance. We have a part to play. But the way forward, the panels of inquiry have been set up. Let them, the head of the Lagos panel is a highly respected, credible person. He's a senior advocate of Nigeria. He also has a track record, by the way, of activism in the student union movement and in other kinds of protest movements as well. So I do believe that he will do a good job. But the problem is whether the government will follow through after the report is submitted, whether the report will be acted upon. In the meantime, I don't hold out much hope for this government, given what has happened, to actually implement any significant far-reaching reforms of the police or of policing generally, or to even listen to the youth. I think there's a sense there's a sense of hubris on the part of the government as we speak, that they've come out ahead. They have the upper hand. When there's that feeling within any entity, the desire to compromise, the desire to do the right thing is never there. We all listened to the broadcast of the president. It was dripping with anger, with self-righteous anger. It's almost as if, how dare you do this to me? He takes these kinds of things as a personal affront. And so this is a government that criminalizes protest, that criminalizes dissent. I wish I could say that I could see a change because of the international outcry, because of the domestic pressure. But as a scholar, I've learned that pessimism is the best defense, because then when something positive happens, then you are all happy. But when something positive does not happen, well, it doesn't bother you that much. So the way forward is for the panel of inquiry to do their job, but for the civil society to keep up the pressure so that the gains of this movement is not lost. That is the risk. That is what I fear the most. That is what gives me sleepless nights. that the people who died would have died for nothing. And the people who were injured, who are still in hospital being treated, would have been injured for nothing. And that all the wonderful things that the youths did, all the organizational genius that they displayed, that all of it will go to waste. That is what I fear. And so we have to put up the pressure, especially, but not exclusively, those of us who do not face any risk. I personally, those of us who are here, we don't have any risk. We don't say, oh, they're going to arrest us, we are going to harass our family. We don't have that risk. There's no excuse for us not to act. So that's the way forward. More pressure, more activism, so that the government will be forced and shamed into doing, if not all of the right things, then at least some of it.
Thank you very much. Professor Okome, moving forward, what's your own intervention, man?
So I do hope that Ayodele and Adeolu would be able to speak as well. But I have no, I agree totally with Moses in terms of what needs to be done. The pressure has to be kept up, but I am very aware of the danger, that protesters have experienced, are experiencing, because people have also been driven underground and people are being threatened. People are in hiding. This is not acceptable behavior from a democratic state. So, I know the government has its own perspective, but we, the people, have our own perspective. So, I think people of conscience must support the protesters. We all want Nigeria to grow into the great nation that it could be. It cannot get into that position of greatness by us doing what we're doing now. So, you know what? The job of the government is to listen to the people. We have all these commissions of inquiry. I think people also have to be given the assurance that when they come forward, they're not going to be just plucked away and disappeared, because this is why people would not come and talk, so that there will be no persecution when people speak out. I also want to say that us in diaspora, we need to help in various ways. But in order to help, we also need to listen. What is it that the people at home need from us? Because yes, we are professors and experts and whatever, but that doesn't mean we have the full understanding of what is needed. So we need to listen. What is it that people need? People at home need to be clear about what they need, and then we work together. Now, see, we are actually in good situations, but all my sisters are living in Lagos, and their children and their grandchildren, and my many cousins. So it's not like, I don't have any skin in the game. When something is happening in Lekki, I have people there, And a lot of the young children who are of the generation of the protesters, my nieces and nephews are part of that group. They are fed up, they're disillusioned, they are angry unjustifiably. And I'm angry because I know that we have brilliant people in Nigeria. We have more natural resources and human resources than most other countries. So why is it that 60 years after our independence, this is still where we are? And then, I think people who, that president's speech is worse than him not having said anything. Because it actually, you would notice that it's after the speech that the whole uproar began. Because you can't disrespect people like that. You can't make people feel as if they're nothing, and then start threatening your citizens. This is not how democracy works. So maybe our leaders, they need courses in Democracy 101, and then a lot of the people that are chastising the protesters, I think we need to be quiet. Because these protesters, what they're calling for is Nigeria as it ought to be. Let us respect our own lives as people. People die in Paris, you'll see our leaders expressing all kinds of condolences. And then your own people you are killing your own people, or they die and you just act like nothing happened. So, for me, the Nigerian government has a huge responsibility to listen to the people. Democracy is about communication between the governed and the government. And no country is worth anything without its people. And then the respect that you show for the lives of your people is the same kind of respect that people are going to accord to you in the international space. So let's be clear, the government of Nigeria has a huge responsibility to do the right thing, because a lot of mistakes have been made, or evil acts have been perpetrated, actually. And we can do better than this. And until that change happens, citizens have a right to keep demanding that we are a democracy, we must act as such. If we want people to come and give testimony, then the government has to give us assurance that they're not going to either kill them or put them in jails in perpetuity or disappear them.
Thank you very much. Olofintuade, moving forward. Over to you.
Okay, unfortunately, taking light. Sorry, NEPA restored light, so we have to switch over to.
Okay,
NEPA.
sorry about that. That's part of Nigerian problems.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Okay, so it's all right. So moving forward, I think it's very, very, very important at this point for the generation that we keep referring as the older generation to provide support and to be there and stop criticizing and acting brand new. It is time they put their voices, they actually act like they have skin in the game, because all I've heard are criticisms, the thugs, the hoodlums, the looting, and none of them, they have made any they've tried. And I'm talking about even people here in Nigeria. I'm not even talking about diasporans, because diasporans have been totally amazing. And it's so important to see Nigerians in the diaspora supporting us and supporting the movement. But the Nigerians, and that is why I keep talking about how the older generation also perpetrate violence, because they are the ones that came in the early days of the protest and said, oh, choose leaders. You should choose leaders. They're the ones that said, see now, you didn't choose leaders. That's why they killed all of you. Like, it's all right for people to be killed. I think if this movement is going to, we can't do it without these people that people keep referring to as the older generations. Because if they had come out when the shootings had started, how many people soldiers will kill?
Yeah.
But they sat in their towers and they're looking down at people that are protesting and saying, oh, see them, they didn't listen to us, see them, and see, God has caught them. And because that's the sense I get. And they're acting like the police state is not violent towards them too. Like, the policeman will not say, give me 50 naira now, and you don't give the policeman 50 naira, and the policeman will not bring out his gun and shoot you. And that's all I have to say, that we are here on this panel and we have friends and we have family members that people are referring to as the older generation, and that they should put away their respectability politics and they should stop demonizing their queer children, and they should listen and they should participate, because when this country, and it will get better with or without them, it had better not be without them, because anybody that is not with the protesters right now is against the protesters, and that is it going forward. Anybody that goes to newspapers and starts talking, and anybody that is on radio and starts saying, oh, like the thugs are not people that were disenfranchised, whatever they call it, and that the hoodlums are not people that are not able to access. I mean, people get score marks in their JAMB and WAEC according to their neighborhoods. It is well known. So all these things, it's either you are with this movement or you're not with this movement. And I advise people that they should go and talk to their parents and talk to their friends and say, you better be for this movement, because with or without you, this train is moving on. And if we leave you behind, you are left behind. That's all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's quite apt. So, Dr. Yekon, moving forward. So what do you think should be done?
All right.
And who should take action? And how should government handle future agitation?
Yeah,
okay.
Well, we need to this from two angles. How do we move forward? Starting from the government. I think first and foremost, there is a need for government to begin to show that Nigerians can trust it. There's a need for those who are in political positions today to realize that things will no longer be the same. The kind of medieval paternalism that we see from the rhetoric of those in power, from the speech of the president to the members of the House of Assembly who have continued to demonize the victims of police brutality prior to, during, and after the protest, shows that the political class has not learned its lessons. And the danger in that is that if we do not address these issues, something worse will happen. Because do not forget that we have been on this issue of reforms for 4 years. Our government has been making promises. Now there is a need for government to make good the promises it has made to reform the police. And it is not just about using these ongoing panels to address past injustices. We must restructure the policing system in a way that will make it more accountable and more efficient. If somebody is serving and committing crime in Lagos and after 3 years you transfer him to Anambra, he commits another series of crimes and from there you move him to Maiduguri, it's very difficult to have accountability. And when people don't live in the communities that they police, it's also difficult to hold them responsible. So for government, it's a holistic thing that needs to affect the structure and the value system of the police force. For the protesters, it is important for us to keep the protest safe and ongoing. We must not relent because what government wants to do is to shut us up and make us feel guilty about what we have set out to achieve. We will be receding into a police state, the type of which we have not witnessed in decades if we allow this movement to slip by us. So there's a need for us to continue. Professor Shoyinka really is not too happy that we actually need to analyze our issues before we get results. It is unfortunate, but it has to be like that. As people say in this part of the world, if you allow a mentally retarded man to handle the funeral of his mother the way he wants, you may have a barbecue on your hand not too soon. So until we get to that point where the Nigerian state will now begin to behave in a very responsible manner towards the citizens and recognize the office of the citizen as being superior over those who are elected into positions of authority, we must use all the legitimate tools available to us to combat police brutality, to combat injustice, to combat oppression within our system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Soyinka, moving forward.
Thank you.
What should be done and who should take action? And how should government handle future agitation?
Thank you. In addition to everything that's been said, I just want to share a few thoughts. I wish we had time for all participants to, to actually speak into this. First thing I think is the urgent restoration of protections. I wouldn't call it a restoration of law and order because we know that law and order by the police has itself been a problem. But if we think in terms of protections, we must be cognizant that just as the youth and those who are demonstrators are currently being hounded, you also have people who have been increasingly exposed to fear. Think about women, young girls in particular, has suffered rape. Reports are coming in about rape, about abuse, and so on. And so you have entire neighborhoods that are currently struggling with the idea of where do we go? Is it going to be vigilante action? What does it mean to live in a neighborhood right now that is concerned? You're afraid of the police, you're afraid of the state, you're afraid of vigilantes in your neighborhood. And so there's a state of fear and anxiety. And I think to be able to restore protections, we have to be aware of the need for coalition building. My thinking is that, as the police are functioning in neighborhoods where they're functioning, there has to also be collaboration with community oversight groups that would work with the police to kind of ensure control to some extent over whatever the police is doing in the immediate period in terms of restoration of protections. I'm thinking about the fact that when we look at the police itself, longer term, we have to look at the situation of internal violence within the police barracks, within the police training. There are women in the police barracks whose plight is just unbelievable. Incredible studies have been done that really we have a police force that is itself embedded in forms of violence where they themselves act out much of the violence they're leaving. And so in terms of their pay, and the pay is so wretched for many of our police that they have been sent out to be weapons on the society. And that has to be transformed if we're really going to expect anything in the short term. Universities, thinking about coalitions, most of our universities are not involved in training at all in terms of law and policing and violence. We don't have programs that actually are designed to rethink the idea of policing, to think about alternatives. We have to begin to look at what we are doing ourselves in terms of the education of the future. How do we produce a different mind frame? How do we actually ensure that college students are attracted towards working in new forms of law and justice and protections in the society? That's not too difficult for universities to sit down and begin to tackle that situation, to look at what it means to tackle patriarchy within our systems, to look at what it means to begin rebuilding a new ethos around social violence, around family violence, around rights for people who are sexually othered, around those who are LGBTQ communities. How do we begin to re-educate, and create that kind of a nucleus of rethinking? I think there's an urgent need for that. Short-term and medium-term helpline right now for reporting police violence. This could be done through a coalition of organizations. We have an incredible amount of feminist organizations, human rights organizations who have been working in the field. Some of them involve massive numbers of youth, others do not. We do need to have a way in which people can safely report what is happening to them and know that it is actually being received by organizations that are dedicated and are being funded and giving support to actually do their work. I think we also need very urgently a strong investigation. The state has set up something. How do we ensure accountability from this investigation? How do we ensure that there's transparency? How does the movement ensure that we have a dedicated website and that people know of that, where you can go for information, where people can actually put what is going on there? We need that to combat misinformation by the government. And then finally, moving ahead to the elections, in terms of larger political and structural change, I think we have to remember that just like the older generation are divided in terms of class, the youth themselves are not immune to the reality of class divides. And this class divide is something that needs urgent attention. We've had a society that for long, the elite we're producing fault lines in our society and reproducing those fault lines. Educational systems are very different for the poor and for the rich. And so the reproduction of cleavages and tensions remains in the society. So as the youth have taken on the NSAS struggle, they would also, I hope, turn their attention to how to create new ways of breaking those fault lines between the youth who are desperately poor and live in situations of real deep violence that has to do with economic violence, structural violence, often speak a very different language of how they feel disaffected from the state, and also may have resentment against the people who lead a particular mobilization. If they can, bridge that gap, which we've not succeeded in bridging in previous generations, then they've also added something that is very distinctive and powerful for the future. So, all our supports, all our willingness to be part of this coalition building, all our willingness to learn from our mistakes in the past and to see how together we can make, a very different step into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this brings us to a very close, but before we close, we need to go back to the participants. And I want to call on the president of the LSA now to get ready in case we have some participants who may want to respond or pass comments to what the panelists have rightly analyzed. those topics and the way forward for the country, what needs to be done. So LSA will put all of this together, and LSA is going to be part of the movement for a better Nigeria through research, through dissemination of knowledge, through collaboration. And we are very sorry that the participants were unable to use the chat room today. That was due to technical error and logistic challenge. But please, you can use my email address to still send your comment across. And if your comment is to be addressed to any of the panelists, I will beg them to please still respond. And once they get their response across to me, I would get the response across to you. So please, whatever comments or contribution you have, please send it to my email at aakinwale@unilag.edu.ng. A is A for Apple. That's the abbreviation of my first name, Akim Akinwale, Akinwale @unilag.edu.ng. Please, whatever you have.
I think some questions. I think we've been able to convert the question chat to a chat. So
okay, do we have questions for the panelists, please?
Actually, people are actually chatting and they're actually having discussion because they can. Yeah. So I think the Q&A button is functioning well.
I've been answering because I'm so savvy with technology.
Yeah, Prof has been asking them.
And you're abusing older generation.
So I think the Q&A thing is working like a chat room.
No, not everybody is answering. So Dr. Akim, can you put your address in the chat? The one you are telling us, Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
So any questions from the audience so we can, or participate or contribution? If you raise up your hand, I will just unmute you and you can talk. Okay, okay. Please go ahead, Dr. Muyo Okome.
Thank you very much. This panel has really delved into the various aspects of all of what's been going on in Nigeria with regards to the EndSARS movement, the various manifestations. But I have one key question. All of your comments, observations, answers, suggestions are very apt. But how do you get these to the Nigerian government as well as the common people on the street? It's all well and good to sit, debate, comment, make suggestions, but at the end of the day, if people on the ground, if the government have no clue of what's going on in this webinar, and the webinar has no impact on anyone, what's the point?
The LSA president, can you quickly respond to that? Because this requires a policy position of the LSA, in terms of moving forward, the role of LSA in all of this.
I think we should, and I think we'll go ahead and write a synthesis of everything that we did today. Before today, the LSA has carried out a couple of activities that are directly related to what is going on in Nigeria. So I would, of course, meet with my colleagues, officers, the board of directors, the committees, and also members to see how we should take this forward. But it's too early for me to make any commitment, given the fact that I can't do this alone. I still have to talk to our colleagues and friends, and of course the panelists. So the panelists can go ahead and tell us exactly what they think we should do, exactly what Dr. Muyo Okome is saying, the way we should mobilize, the kind of report we can write, and how we should follow up and make sure that this report gets to the power that be.
Do we still have any comment from the participants?
My comment is we have to ask the protesters what is needed. And then, I think LSA has a responsibility to then discuss and find ways in which there would be meaningful response to those needs. But this is a community of scholars, so documentation is important, analysis is important, and I think that can actually be an immediate response to this situation. But beyond that, if we call this organization Lagos Studies Association, you owe a responsibility to the people of Lagos, whom you are studying for a living, to do better than just documentation and analysis that is in the armchair. So, but I think that's something that needs to be deliberated on, because it's also a democratic organization, right? So the president cannot impose his will on the general membership.
Yeah, you're right, Prof. And that's, for example, the statement we released about the violence. Well, the board of directors approved it. So it wasn't just a statement released by an individual, it was approved by the board of directors. So, and I agree with you that the LSA has to do something that is that directly impacts what is going on in Nigeria. And that's why we hold our conference in Lagos every year. But so we're taking notes, and we'll see how to make sure that what we have done today translates effectively to what is going on ground. So I think another person, Buki Adeola, wants to talk. Please go ahead.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you for this opportunity. It was insightful, and I'm happy I was part of it. I want to say that to the protesters, my advice is, and I've been, although I didn't go to the front to protest, even though I'm young, I wish I did join, but I was working and in my own way, joining in the struggle from afar. But I think that if we should put everything in writing and present it to the government rather than, keep being on the street. Maybe we were on the streets for too long. I don't know. I feel that way. Maybe too much time was spent on the streets, and then that was how everybody, all the wicked people came and hijacked the situation. Maybe everything should be put in writing, present it, give a time frame, and then afterwards, if nothing is done, maybe go back again or get another strategy. But we have to keep going back to the table to make sure that they know what, the government knows what we want and they do it. Or else we'll just end up doing this struggle and to go like any other. After a while, there's so much a human being can keep doing and not get tired of.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I'd like to answer that question.
I think it's important for us to.
Dr. Yekon, please hold on. I think Olofintuade is speaking. Olofintuade, you were trying to say something? Okay, please make it brief, because we have been keeping our participants for more than 2 hours now.
Yes, I want to answer the question on the streets for too long. Maybe we should write to the government. What they call gaslighting. People have genuine concerns. They're on the streets not because they want to be killed. They're asking for something legitimate. You can't tell us how to express our way and the table. Because you have seen what happened. If there was a table, the government would have acceded to our request in the first. They won't meet up. What happened?
Yeah, so please let's allow the audience to make their contribution. Mubarak Admila, please go ahead.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Hello, can you hear me?
Please go ahead and be brief.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. All that has been enumerated by the panelists are genuine problem and solution to what the answers. And what I'm adding is the police as an entity is also a victim of irresponsibility on the part of the government. I give you an instance of you looking from the angle of the housing the police are being offered to stay in is something that is dehumanizing. That's number one. Even from the training college, you have an instance where they are training. Someone needs to have access to the extra fund that they should have used to complete their training. Or you also have an instance where the police are being paid a stipend of 150 naira daily for feeding during their training. So the government irresponsibility actually brought us to this angle where virtually every individual, whether you work on the street or you work in the office, you are a victim of SARS. So those are my contributions. Whatever we are doing should actually involve the actual reform of the police as an entity. And all this summation can actually be put up and sent in form of a note to the governor or to the Lagos State House of Assembly for them to actually think about effecting some of those.
Okay, thank you. Oh, thank you so much. So let's get another contributor. F. Young, please go ahead.
Okay, good evening, everyone.
Good evening,
I want to appreciate the opportunity of attending this. I just want to talk about the structure and strategy of the protest. For me, I think at the point the government started acceding to these SARS, whether it was real, I think at that point, the strategy would have been to withdraw, watch what the government would do, because they started setting up committee. Then if they don't act, who can come back? Because staying too long on that protest, actually, also the government to actually change their own strategy, bringing in talks, and we can see how it turned out to be. Then my question is really, in terms of strategy too, don't we think it would have been better this protest was organized in a way that it did not ground economic activities? Because given the economic situation of the country, people became agitated. People that lived on daily income, maybe from the street, most of those things stopped. So I think it also influenced the violent nature that some political players played in, because as a person, I've been in security for over 16 years now. I want to really tell you that every highlight the panelists submitted was apt, because I've gotten experience with police in so many occasions, and it is worrying.
Victor, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ifion.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity.
And please be brief. I'll be brief.
Yeah. What I just like to ask, I've actually put it on the platform. I wanted to know that if the government failed to reform the police, what should be the next line of action? That is my concern. If the government failed to reform the Nigerian police, what should be the next line of action? Thank you.
Yeah.
I think agitation will continue, though we are still going to look at that and make a recommendation as a professional association. But logically, if the civil society is not satisfied, of course, struggle continues. That's the usual logical response to a recalcitrant state, So our situation in the country is not sustainable. So we have to continue the struggle until we get, Nigeria to work, for everybody. So we not relent until the system is able to work.
Okay. Umar Yandaki, go ahead.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Okay. I have been keenly following all the discussions, and they have quite been insightful and instructive. I am most particularly commend Professor Moses, Okome, and Shoyinka. Um, I would like to take us back to the issue of police and policing in Nigeria. You know, the protest was actually about NSAS, but at its peak, it engaged the mainstream or conventional Nigeria police force. Um, uh, with my experience here in the north, from northern Nigeria, I know a number of the uh, police officers at the lower rank, I mean the subalterns, uh, are quite not radical in most instances. Then, uh, throughout this discourse, I found out that the police was being treated or defined as a force or a national bureau instead of looking into the actual circumstances of the police officers. Because let's understand that the police is not a homogenic uh, force. There are quite a number of people
Okay, thank you, Umar. So let's move to the next.
Officers with different feelings, with different a number of this.
The audio from the last speaker was breaking towards the end. So we have Mary Aruna now.
Okay, good evening. And this is quite enlightening and very interesting. I just want to contribute and say that it's good to have documents. But documents, you understand that when they get to the hands of those who should read them, I really don't know how many people will sit down to read what exactly had been compiled. It takes just one strong person to read and to translate it. But from what I've heard today, I know that most of the protesters and even the government are on social media platforms. I would appreciate if you break this into an Instagram page and keep preaching this message as either a series, you take these lectures and provide these solutions. Over 6,000 youths are here. Even the government officials are looking for solutions and informations on this social page. The reason why they could get to the protesters at the Lagos toll gate was that they knew they were consistently there. They were on the social media, on the Instagram, WhatsApp, and watching them do these things. So what we have heard today, I would appreciate that if they are broken into series and loaded on these social platforms, and the youth listen to them, the parents listen to them, the society listens to them, the government listens to them, even the police force are also looking for information on this platform. I don't want it to just, it's good to have a document, but then the document, it will only be submitted to the government. What about the youth? We also need to hear this. This is very, very interesting. Despite the NSAS movement, the NSAS talks, this should come apt. It should just come back on the WhatsApp platform, on the Instagram platform as a series. It can be broken down. And I tell you that this will really go a long way. This shouldn't be dropped under the carpet and said it will be formed in a book. There are so many documents. I work for government. There are so many documents that people have not read. Once they reach to page 5, that is it. So scholars like you here would say they would read, but then I speak from the other end, they might not read it. But they can look at the social media every morning when people wake up, they go through their social media platforms. And SAS, over 6,000 youths who were all on the platform watching what next. 2 hours of this lecture shouldn't be wasted if it is not going to be posted on social media. And I'm sure that you know that once it's posted on social media, people tell the others, and it gets to the State House. They even call on the government to come. Somebody will say, if you know Fashola, tell him this message is for him. So this is laudable, and I really appreciate everyone who has spoken today. I'm really touched that we have such people. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mary Aruna. Greet your people in Abuja.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, any other comment from the participants? President, can you see any hands up?
Can I just help to read out the question of Umar Yandaki? who was cut off by his system.
Yeah.
He said, in this discourse, the police was largely treated as a body, a state bureau. What do you think about the subaltern police officers who are more or less used by the state, or at least circumstantially entrapped by the reckless manner in which they are treated by the state to act the way they do? He says, since these subalterns are also part of the lowest strata of the society, with some of them grappling to put food on their tables, what do you think about the psychological confusion some of them are subjected to when they are ordered to act against their fellow citizens of the lower strata? And what do you think about the subaltern police who at the peak of the protest were also killed by the protesters who were angry? So I just thought I would finish the question he put there.
Thank you very much, Prof, for your intervention. So any other comments?
Dr. Rosemary, go ahead.
Okay, good evening, everyone.
Good evening, ma'am.
I'll be very brief. From what happened in the past week, we have discovered that there are two types of youths in Nigeria. The youths who are educated, focused, are the ones who were the peaceful protesters. And then the other ones are those who vandalized, looted, and destroyed property. Those ones are uneducated, and we need to bring them on board when we talk about changing the system. How do we get to tell them that they don't have to do that to show their displeasure at the system, and also to participate in future peaceful protests without necessarily having to loot or destroy properties?
That's a very brilliant question. So which of the panelists want to respond, please?
Okome would like to respond.
Please go ahead, ma'am.
You know what? I think I'm really, I'm perplexed about how we want to create this divide. And are we conscious of the fact that poor people in Nigeria should not be ground, down in the way that they're being ground down? That, there are people whose children don't have food, and our government is stealing money. And, there's a limit. I think Nigerians have actually been very patient and very long-suffering. So, if we insist on not hearing people, when they see opportunities, when there's crisis, they will make their voices heard. And, violence is speaking about inequality. It's speaking about trauma that we have put people through. People are dying from just going to have a baby. And then every time our government people have headache, they run to countries where the health system works. And we think it's okay. So when people are protesting, this is part of what they're protesting about. Not, and there are people who are comfortable. The way they protest will be different from the way in which people whom we have all sat down to allow to be dispossessed protest. When I talk about structural violence, I think people missed it, okay? Structural violence normalizes pain. Once we see poor people dying, we say, some of us will pray for them. Some of us will give them handouts that will last for a little bit. But what structurally are we doing to make sure that we all Nigerians are enjoying the wealth of our country? We have made it okay for some people to steal it, and then when it's election time, they bring bread or rice or whatever. So let's stop all this, and I have a video on YouTube actually where I talk about it, that we have to use this as an opportunity to build a new Nigeria where all lives are valued, not just the lives of my children because I'm rich or I'm privileged or I can pay for better school for them. And then look at the schools that the poor children are going to. Are they not human beings? So, sometimes people rebel and they use violence to make the powerful people feel what they have been feeling. So if we want peace in Nigeria, let us start listening in a new way. Let us start respecting poor people. Let us start treating them as we treat our friends. And it's going to take a lot of rebuilding because, people are angry already now. So do Nigerians want peace? This is an opportunity to become humble as people of affluence who can afford internet to come and participate on webinar. Me, I'm tired, I don't think we should be doing this kind of division.
And can I just also add that
yes, please add.
In addition to demonizing the poor, we have to be careful about romanticizing the rich and the educated. In 1986, when we opened the prisons in Ife, we were all educated kids, but we thought it was the defiance, of our time. So we were all capable of also being violent, even when you are educated. So creating this good youth and the bad youth discourse is very dangerous, and it's often very inaccurate. That kind of assumes that, the violence is bad and therefore it is the poor who are violent and therefore they're bad. And then the wealthy educated are the ones who we romanticize. We have to also be careful that it doesn't work that way and create this artificial, kind of a fracture. But having said that, going back to Professor Okome, Professor Moyo Okome's original thesis, how does this message get across? We also think about what it means for us to, look for different forms of communication. We're talking about writing up something for the state government. What does it mean to use drama, to use theater, to use, popular artists? This is what they're using to kind of reach outside of just the scholarly space, to say there are other spaces in which people are articulating and are talking about the problem. And we have to consciously be aware of how our language often is directed towards a particular group of people, a particular class. And if we're serious about breaking down those lines, then we have to do it and utilize all the weapons at our disposal in kind of reaching that in our message across, or conversation, having a conversation across lines.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Let me also quickly make a comment. I want to differ a little bit from Professor Okome and Professor Shoyinka, because in as much as I think that there is a need for us to be careful in not reinforcing this divide, we must also not be too correct to the point of avoiding the reality. There are 21 million Nigerians today who are unemployed. 22 million Nigerians are unemployed. 11 million children are out of school. These are facts that we cannot deny. And so I think acknowledging the division does not necessarily mean that we are demeaning or looking down on our fellow compatriots. I think it gives us more power. It gives us more motivation to call out the government so that it will begin to live up to its responsibilities. The point is that we have a very big gulf. We have the social inequality in Nigeria has grown so wide that we have a few people who have access to the few institutions that are barely functioning, and then we have the mass of our youth out there who are out of school, out of job, and they need to find a place where they will vent their frustration. That is where the state needs to take very good care. If you are trying to shut down the social media and shut up those who are criticizing you on social media, what you are going to have are the millions out there who do not speak the language of social media. That does not mean that those who are on social media do not have the propensity for violence. But those who are out there do not have that means at all to get across to you as government. And so we must continue to acknowledge that we have this division, but we must also make the point that it is unacceptable. I think that we need to be careful not to deny the divide that we have that is so obvious, because we do not want it to seem as if we are creating this division. What I think we should do with it is to ensure that we make it as a point of reference in dealing with the government to say Nigeria is sitting on a keg of gunpowder and we cannot continue to kick the can down the road for too long, the explosion next time will be worse than what we have experienced if nothing is done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So what's coming from these three analyses is that two options are available for Nigerian youths. Either they fight different battles or they unify their battles. That's what's likely to happen. Either the so-called educated and the so-called uneducated find a way of coming together and fight a common battle, or either they continue to fight their different battle. The current situation is that those one who are labeled as uneducated or not too elitist are fighting their own battle. The so-called elite youth are also fighting their own battle. So if the two battles are unified, possibly there will be a stronger way of negotiating for breakthrough. That's an option. If they are not able to achieve that, they will continue to fight different battles, and that will make it more difficult for the agent or the state to contain whatever is likely to happen out of this. Thank you very much. So I think we can move forward if we still have any other comments.
Yes, Bola Oshibodu, do you want to talk?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Hello. Can you all
Hi.
hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
I have been raising my hands up for the past so many minutes.
We are very sorry. Better
anyway,
late than never.
No problem. No problem. Thank you very much. I don't want to sound like a broken record. So I will just say, Mary Aruna said everything I wrote down that I wanted to say. So I won't repeat that.
Okay.
Number two, I think there's something in this, our Nigerian system. Are you all aware that the current IG served at the Interpol for over 5 years and he did very well? But as soon as he came back, I have not seen the impact of Interpol in whatever he has done so far. This is one of the things we have to look into. Most people don't know. And when I tell them, they say, I interacted with him between 1998 and 2005 when I was in the AU, because he was the one who made it easier for me when I was in the African Union Commission, while I was establishing the Drug Control and Crime Prevention Department for the African Union Commission for almost 10 years. He did extremely well, honestly. But since he now joined, he returned now, business as usual. So why am I saying this? I think what you guys have to discuss next, to me, is a suggestion. This one is just part one. No? Part two now should be, you have to now look into the police and the military. Those those people down the line, they have their own grievances. They are suffering. You see all the budgets they make every year. Where do they end up at the end of the budget year? Go to all the police barracks. Go to military barracks. You will be ashamed to be a Nigerian. So there should be a part two, continuation of this. We are just, you see, we are complaining about this police. I'm not supporting them. Please don't misunderstand me. But at the same time, this is an opportunity for us to help them to help us. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your intervention. Thank you very much. That's vital. We'll look into that. Any other comments?
And,
okay,
have
Prof.
you paid attention to the protests? Because the protesters were actually advocating for the police. And the protesters were trying to build a cross-class coalition. And I heard people speaking in language that ordinary people would understand. And the whole effort to feed people, to give people hospital care and everything are things that these protesters did. That actually, we didn't see in previous protests. So, I think we have to really pay attention and go back and think about what happened and how these protests were organized in a really, just extraordinary way. that tried to build a large tent, inclusive of the fact that they were saying that the police are underpaid, and really the conditions are terrible in their various barracks, and the training and recruitment and everything. So I really agree. Yes, we should do actually parts 1 to 10. Everybody that can make video you can get a YouTube channel and talk about your ideas there, and people really do go and see. You can be on Twitter, use social media to, talk about many of these issues, but we also need to study what has happened, because a lot of impressive organizing and, just putting on peaceful protests happened. And we have to honor that. As for the police, who knows what, but okay, it's weak institutions, okay? Interpol is a strong institution. Their standard operating procedures, everybody follows them, or most people. And if you don't, you'll be punished. Nigeria doesn't have those strong institutions. Those are the things we need to build. It's not juju, it's not rocket science. We can do it. So we better get to work, but it's not work that we can do in a day or in a year. It's going to take a long time, because it took a long time for us to get into this mess that we are in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think we have spent close to 3 hours now, and whatever has a beginning should definitely have an end. And the matter we are engaging is an endless discussion. Until we get the system right, discussion continues. We cannot finish it in one day. So on this note, I want to thank all the panelists for sharing from their wealth of experience. God will continue to replenish the fountain of your wisdom. I also thank the participants for their resources, for their energy, for their perseverance. It's not easy for us in Nigeria to attend a webinar and stay there for close to 3 hours. And we still have substantial number of people. I really appreciate you. This shows you really have the interest of our country at heart, and continue to work together until we get a system that we desire. Thank you very much. God bless you. And I wish you safe journey to your destination.
Thank you. I'm clapping. I'm clapping for you, but you cannot see me. I'm clapping.
We are at our destination at home. Oh,
yes.
You are traveling safe journey.
You are traveling away from your computer to your bedroom.
Madam Oshibodu, thank you very much for your.
Thank you so much
for your comments.
Ayodele, thank you very much.
I will call you.
And Ayodele, where's Ayodele?
She's there.
Give kudos.
Thank you, Professor.
My class.
Yeah.
Thank you, Prof.
Great job.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, President, over to you.
President, when is part 2?
Professor,
we're now Nollywood.
Ojogbo, we probably have to. There should be. I don't want to be emphatic until I talk to my officers, my colleagues, and the board of directors.
Talk to them quickly. Talk to them. It's very urgent.
Yes, I will talk to everyone involved, and
Professor, I won't let you rest.
Don't let him rest, though. He's the big Oga here.
No, I'm not the big Oga. I'm not
the police on part 2 panel.
I'm not the big Oga. Honestly, I will. Talk to my officers, the board of directors, and everyone advising LSA. There's a lot of people advising us behind the scenes. Then we see the next action. But this is not going to be the end of the conversation about this topic. It's not going to be the end. I promise.
Very good.
Tell us about the historical documents that were affected.
So for now, it's difficult to say in absolute terms if those documents were among the documents destroyed. The repository is an old repository, dating back to the early 1900s. So we don't know now, and we don't want to be too publicly express our position over whether documents, because we don't know where they are. But hopefully, but like most people have been saying, it's not just about those historical documents. It's also about the document generated today. Because when you look at the destruction, the first building, that is where most of the documents on land leads, everything.
Yes.
Document. So what happens in the next 10, 20, 40 years, given the fact that the ones destroyed, I was at the court last year to advocate for reopening of the whole old repository, which is far at the back. It's actually not at the front. But the images we're seeing is not telling us if those documents are part of the documents destroyed. But we still have to have that conversation and see what happens.
So I think also this is time to start thinking of digitization. You know,
yes.
Keeping documents on paper, yes, we should have those paper documents. But another aspect of technology we can use is to help to rescue a lot of the stuff that is being destroyed, even from ants and termites and mice.
Yeah.
In our archives,
You're right.
So, I've been very, very agitated about it. And I think it's something that scholars could get together and write grant applications to start trying to do.
Yeah, you're right.
UNESCO helped, and Ford Foundation also. They helped the people of Mali with the manuscripts.
Manuscripts, yes.
Ancient manuscripts, so we should think of doing something similar.
Yeah, you're right, Prof. But the question of ownership is problematic. So, I mean, I just got back from Nigeria in August for 5 months. Most of these documents are considered to be private personal documents. So the ones in Mali, it's not possible to digitize. Even if you have $1 million right now, you still have to resolve the question of who is the owner of this document.
You have to. Okay, so it's a process. And I
have to leave. I'm late for another meeting.
Okay.
Stay well, everyone. Thank you so much.
I think the parameters can be worked out.
Yeah,
is what I'm saying.
Prof, yeah. Definitely we can talk about that so that
Professor Tobe, let me warn you. The civil servants, they will make sure you cannot do anything unless the money you raise, you give it to them. Look, you will face a lot of opposition. I can tell you.
I know, my sister has been working in Nigeria for a long time, so I know all these things that you are saying, and it's part of the
challenge. Civil servants are our wahala in Nigeria. I'm telling you.
Yeah, thank you so much. We still have the LSA conference is coming. We are planning a panel on documents, Nigerian historical documents, politics of ownership, digitization, and the conversation. Thank you so much.
So hold Zahid, don't let him go. He's the Oga. Hold him.
Okay.